I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 205th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the workings of your own brain, which certainly includes making the best use of serendipity, especially serendipity of the medical variety. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about some findings that I think fall into that category with a drug best known as Ambien. This is also called zolpidem. And although it's best known as a sleep aid, there seem to be some extra cases where it can be useful for a variety of neurological disorders. I'm going to be talking in the main interview with Dr. Nick Bomalaski, who put together a review of the literature where some unexpected and promising findings came from the use of Ambien. A lot of head scratchers, but probably also some good scientific rocks for people to look under in the future. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, keeping things vaguely sleep-related, I'm going to tell you about some recent findings about neurons that might help us override our need to sleep. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So when you see some old codger wearing plaid pants pulled up past his belly button, and you say something like, "Hey, old guy, nice pants," you might think that you're being somewhat of a jerk, and you would be right. But in a very specific way, you might actually be doing something helpful. Because according to recent research published in the journal Cortex, the inability to discern sarcasm and other types of deceptive speech, like outright lying, can actually be an effective early warning signal that something is wrong with the brain, might be an early warning sign for oncoming dementia, Alzheimer's, or a variety of other neurological disorders. The study conducted involved 175 older adults, some of whom were perfectly healthy, some of whom had one of a handful of cognitive impairments. And the study was taking advantage of the fact that detecting lies and sarcasm is a relatively complex cognitive task. If you're bilingual or partially bilingual, you know that probably one of the last things a person picks up when they're learning a new language is the ability to understand humor. Sometimes this is about plays on words, but sometimes it's just because the brain is so busily engaged in processing the basic syntax that also parsing the layers of meaning of, is this actually accurate? Is the person being sarcastic? Are they just completely lying to me? That's bandwidth you might not have available. You might not have it available if you're learning a new language because the language processing is taking a lot of work, or if it's a language that you understand well or where you're a native speaker. It might be, according to this study, because of oncoming dementia symptoms, says this study's lead author, Dr. Catherine Rankin. Many dementia patients cannot effectively detect lies, and making use of this fact can allow them to be identified and diagnosed earlier. The study was conducted by showing participants videos that had social interactions, and those social interactions had either deceptive, sarcastic, or completely sincere speech. Not surprisingly, the sincere speech was well understood by all of the groups equally well, but the sarcasm and deceptive speech was a lot more likely to not get identified as such if the participant was in one of the groups suffering from a known neurological disorder. Here's the lead author Rankin again. If somebody has strange behavior and they stop understanding things like sarcasm and lies, they should see a specialist to help make sure that this is not the start of one of these diseases. The authors also point out that a change in a person's sense of humor could be a warning sign. If somebody for all of their life has been into highbrow humor, satire, or Monty Python-style absurdism, things like that, and suddenly their family notices that they're starting to like slapstick humor and fart jokes, that sounds like a joke unto itself, but this could actually be a legitimate warning sign that something is changing in their brain, and it might not be a bad idea to get things checked out. This sort of cognitive downshifting to easier styles of humor or not understanding things like sarcasm is also the kind of thing that would be seen years in advance of the more overt symptoms of dementia or oncoming Alzheimer's, things like memory loss that people know to look for. So keeping an eye out for these less well-known signs could really give people like a decade of advantage of being able to start jumping on these problems earlier, says Rankin. Friends and relatives of those with dementia reported seeing changes around 9 years before the more typical memory problems. But it's important to recognize that there is kind of this trade-off you need to balance off the dementia avoidance against missing out on an extra decade of really good fart jokes. And yes, that was sarcasm.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes this week. Listener Henroin from the UK says, "A properly interesting way to fill audio vacant time. I have found inspiration from many episodes and particularly enjoying the neurotransmitter episodes." And somebody from the USA whose iTunes handle is in, I believe these are Korean characters, which I'm incapable of sounding out, said, I've just found this awesome podcast on my 6-hour drive from Northern California to home in LA and could not stop listening to it. Thank you so much. Well, a big thanks to both Henroin and the impronounceable listener, and to everyone else that's been leaving iTunes reviews or otherwise helping Smart Drug Smarts to percolate across the internet. We are firmly in November now. Winter is coming. We got to the end of the October surprise that Vitamunk was doing last month, and I think all the winners have been contacted now, including the big winner who got a year supply of something. I'm not sure if that's actually been decided on. I'll try to find out by next week what the big selection was, the year giveaway of some supplement on the Vitamunk.com shelf. They've got a lot to choose from over there. The Adaptotrax blend of adaptogenic herbs, an electrolyte formula called Fortilite, and just this past week, they released something called the Hunger Smack Appetite Suppressant. So check out Vitamunk for a long list of supplement options. There's probably something for almost every occasion there, contest or no contest. Smart Drug Smarts has the Brain Breakfast newsletter. If you're not signed up for that yet, you are cordially invited to do so. We'll be letting you know about things as they come up throughout the holiday season. It's getting to be that time where we might have some oddball things to throw out in the Smart Drug Smarts grab bag, and you can sign up for the Brain Breakfast at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Finally, a big thanks to the fine folks over at Axon Labs, home of the stacks Mitogen and Nexus. Got a couple of Mitogen in my system today, no Nexus yet, but the day is young. Mitogen I will often pop as a coffee substitute early in the morning, especially if I'm going to be getting in a workout early in the day. Although mitochondria, the target organelle of mitogen, are particularly dense in brain cells, they are found throughout the body, including skeletal muscles, things that you use while working out. So mitogen is nice in that it's both a cognitive pick-me-up and a physical energy booster as well. You can find both Mitogen and Nexus online at axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Nick Bomalaski, who is a brain injury fellow at the University of Washington, and we're going to be talking about a review of the literature that he recently put together on a drug called Zolpidem, better known as Ambien. The last year I was able to get numbers on was 2012, where it was prescribed over 40 million times in the US, so it's out there quite a bit. Very effective at initiating sleep onset. It doesn't necessarily help maintain sleep once a person is already asleep, but as far as getting someone to sleep in the first place, it's quite effective. Like any drug, it comes with a full complement of warning labels: don't operate heavy machinery, avoid driving, things like that. And long-term use has been associated with both drug tolerance and substance dependence on Zolpidem, as well as rebound insomnia. When people stop taking it, sometimes they can have a more difficult time than they did originally falling asleep. But all of this is a little beside the point, because what we're going to be talking about today is potential uses of Zolpidem for things other than falling asleep. Dr. Bomalaski's paper definitely brings some interesting things to light. They say that once is dumb luck, twice is a coincidence, but 3 times is a pattern, and he's got a lot more than 3 instances, 3 citations of interesting and unexpected findings that have come from the use of Zolpidem. But let's take a listen and hear what he's learned. This is Dr. Nick Bomalaski talking about Ambien.
A friend of mine, he's actually a software engineer, probably 3 or 4 years ago, he sent me a video where they were discussing this young gentleman in South Africa who had been in a vegetative state for 3 or 4 years following a motor vehicle accident, had a severe traumatic brain injury, and this young gentleman had appeared restless to his caretakers, so they had requested from the physician that he get some Zolpidem, which is more commonly known under the brand name Ambien, sold as a sleep medication, to see if this would maybe help with his restlessness. And within 30 minutes of the patient receiving this very average dose of Ambien, he had awoken from his vegetative state and was communicating with his mother and was able to interact with his environment in a way that he hadn't done in over 4 years. And then part of this same video I had seen showed this gentleman who lived down in Florida who had worked as a voiceover professional for like radio and TV. And following a dental procedure, he had developed what's called oromandibular dystonia. And that's where you basically lose the ability to coordinate movements in your face and your jaw due to prolonged contractures of the muscles in the face. So basically this was devastating to this gentleman who relied solely on his voice for a living. And I don't recall exactly what the background was for him receiving Zolpidem, but again, 30 minutes after he received it, he could speak very clearly. There's actually a video of him before and after Zolpidem, and the effects were striking and far exceeded the effects of any other pharmacologic intervention that I had ever heard of. So just out of my own curiosity, I started doing my own little searches through the literature, and I kept finding more and more out there about not only treating people with disorders of consciousness, such as vegetative state or minimally conscious state, but also lots of movement disorders, such as Parkinson's disease, studies treating patients following stroke. And I also realized that no one had really compiled all this literature to bring it together and say, what have we observed here? What do we know about these effects? What don't we know? And what sorts of investigations do we need to set up moving forward in order to understand these effects better and know whether or not we should be using these clinically or not? Because currently, zolpidem is not often used to treat things like Parkinson's disease or dystonias, or even sometimes disorders of consciousness. And I was wondering why that was the case, considering how extraordinary the effects could be.
Yeah, those are pretty dramatic results when statistical significance only requires that you reliably move the needle in a way that's not chance, but the actual overt impact might still be really small. Here you've got almost the exact mirror. You don't have enough study cases, but what seems to be the impact is huge.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And like I said, there's really nothing else that's available out there that can do anything like that. So I felt like it was certainly something worth pursuing and looking more into in more detail.
When Ambien is being used for sleep promoting as is normally prescribed, what do we know about the mechanism of action there? And does it seem like that same mechanism of action might be at play in some of these other cases, or do we suspect that something altogether different is going on?
There's a couple of theories. Nothing is known 100% for certain, but basically the way Ambien or zolpidem works is that it binds to this very specific subtype receptor of the GABA-A receptor complex. That's a bit of a mouthful, but GABA is one of those more common neurotransmitters and primarily functions in an inhibitory role. So, for instance, the effect of Ambien as a hypnotic is through these GABA receptors, mostly in areas scattered throughout the cortex, especially the frontal cortex, and that's where it can have a hypnotic effect.
Hypnotic in this case just meaning sleep promoting, not hypnotic as in hypnosis. So sleep promoting, that's pretty much its reason for existence right now.
That's the only indication that it's actually FDA approved for right now is use as a hypnotic. So it also turns out that these very specific receptors are also found in parts of the brain that help to regulate things like arousal and motor coordination, primarily in the basal ganglia and their connections with the thalamus. And the thalamus is sort of the central relay station for a lot of different functions in the brain. And in certain cases of brain injury, the circuits in the midbrain and the basal ganglia and the thalamus get disrupted, and the thalamus can be overly inhibited. Primarily, this happens through the globus pallidus interna, which inhibits the thalamus. So the globus pallidus interna is rich in these specific receptors, and so when you take Ambien, it functions as an inhibitor of the inhibitor, and thus is...
It's like a double negative, yeah.
You get a double negative and a positive. So the thinking is that by inhibiting the globus pallidus, you have downstream activation of the thalamus, and thus you have downstream activation of all the functions that the thalamus helps to regulate, which includes level of consciousness and motor coordination. The area of the brain that is affected by Parkinson's disease is part of that basal ganglia. It affects what's called the substantia nigra. So that all connects into with the globus pallidus and the thalamus and the motor cortices. I believe it's that disruption to those circuits where zolpidem has an opportunity to have its effect, even though it's not necessarily affecting dopamine the way that something like levodopa carbidopa would be. So essentially, you have a double negative, and that helps to normalize downstream functions in the brain. Another theory is that following brain injury, cells or neurons can take two pathways generally. One is glutamate mediated, and that generally leads to cell death. And the other one is to go into a state of dormancy. And this is sort of a protective survival mechanism. And oftentimes, if you look on initial neuroimaging, it may appear that certain areas of the brain are inactive or potentially dead. But in reality, those cells are still alive. They're not active. They're not doing their normal function. And it's believed that in these certain types of cells, there's an upregulation of the specific subtype receptor that Ambien binds to. So you can have an activating effect through that mechanism as well to sort of reverse that neurodormancy.
Why would that neurodormancy happen in the first place? Like, what would be an adaptive reason that we would have neurons able to fall into that state?
I believe that part of it is just as a survival mechanism in a moment of extreme stress on the brain. Let's say, for instance, the brain's not getting enough oxygen, and these cells require oxygen to survive. So by going into a dormant state and basically shutting down their cellular metabolism, they have a better chance of surviving. Now, why do they stay in that dormant state after the immediate stress has resolved. Part of that might be due to a phenomenon called diaschisis, which is one of my favorite words. And basically what that refers to is when a part of the brain that is functionally connected to another part of the brain stops working because that other functionally connected part of the brain is injured or not active. So you can have a part of the brain that is still healthy, potentially functional tissue, but because of its relationships to other structures in the brain, it's just sitting there and not doing its normal function or normal job. So Ambien can help to sort of reverse that diaschisis.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a mechanical analogy for that, but you could think of a lot of times where that would be a good thing to do. If you just broke your arm, then you don't want to go moving your shoulder, even if your shoulder works perfectly well.
Yeah, or like a bicycle, the wheels aren't going to turn if the pedals are broken, even if the wheels are in perfect condition.
Yeah, I like your analogy better than mine. So how would you like to see this followed up on? It seems like there's enough meat here to get people curious. What do you think is the right next investigative move?
So one of the great limitations with the literature that I found during my review was that a lot of it, in fact, the majority of it, was sort of what we refer to as low-level evidence. Things like case reports, case series, a single subject interventional trials. Basically, studies where you don't have a lot of controls and there's a high bias towards positive publication. So let's say I have a patient who is in a vegetative state and I give them Ambien and nothing happens. I'm much less likely to write up a report and submit it for publication than if I give it to somebody and they wake up.
Sure.
So it's hard to really see the larger pattern when you're just dealing with a lot of these very small reports. There were a few larger randomized control trials. I think out of the 67 studies I found, there were 9 randomized control trials. And in terms of disorders of consciousness, patients with vegetative state or minimally conscious state, we saw an effect ranging anywhere from 4 to 7% if you just gave it to everyone who was in that kind of condition. And the thinking is that if we can figure out a pattern on who's responding and who's not responding, which is probably based on the location and nature of the injury, then that response rate could potentially be much higher.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're tempted to think that there's got to be some signal in the noise that we're not seeing. The people that it's having an effect on, the effect is so strong, but overall the percent of people being affected isn't that high. What's the common element there that hasn't been teased out yet?
Yeah, there's clearly some dramatic differences between those who are responding and not responding. And as I mentioned earlier, there's specific structures in the subcortical parts of the brain that can control things like level of consciousness and motor control. And we think that when patients have injuries specifically to those areas, that they're more likely to be a responder. And furthermore, patients who have injury to the brainstem tend not to respond that well just because zolpidem doesn't affect that part of the brain very much. Mm-hmm. So getting back to your question about what more do we need to do, I think we just need to try to organize better randomized controlled trials. So we need to make sure that we have enough patients and we're using randomization, we're using appropriate placebo controls, appropriate blinding, things that stand up to the expectations for scientific rigor. And these studies can be very difficult to conduct just because these patient populations can be difficult to access.
Right. It's hard to put out a call for people that are in a vegetative state.
Yeah, exactly. And they can be quite costly and the logistics can be very difficult, which has been maybe one of the barriers to having more studies done like this. Additionally, the manufacturers of zolpidem haven't really shown any interest in helping to finance these kind of studies, possibly because the patient population is relatively small.
Is zolpidem, is the IP still intellectually owned by the company that created it, or is it something that's out there in the public domain?
It's generic now. The medication's been around since the early 90s, so it's been off patent for a while. I think there might be different formulations like an extended release, a sublingual administration, and then I think there's a mist form, an inhaled form. And those might be on patent, but I'm not sure exactly.
I've got the number 20 years in my head as how long something stays sort of patent protected when it's first created. Is that a real number? Is 20 years the number, or does that vary sometimes?
I think it can be variable. And I know that a lot of the pharmaceutical manufacturers have sort of found tricks for extending their patents.
You know what I've heard? This might be like an intellectual property wives' tale, but supposedly every time that Mickey Mouse, the character, is old enough that he's going to enter the public domain, the massive legal edifice of Disney goes to work and tweaks things in the laws just enough so you or I or anybody can't sell a Mickey Mouse t-shirt without Disney getting its cut. And that change in the law initiated by Disney kind of pulls a lot of other intellectual property law along with it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's always a moving target. And our friends in Washington, D.C. are always trying to find ways of getting around those rules. But generally, at least for the normal instant release pill form, it's generic and it's fairly inexpensive.
It's frustrating hearing about these cases where the actual numbers of people in the patient population, they're not large enough to really make it financially worthwhile for the big research dollars, either from private industry or really from public institutions. So potentially we're sort of sitting on our hands on what could be some life-changing therapies for very small populations of people.
Yeah, exactly. And this specific patient population has a hard time advocating for itself. What I think is going on is that a lot of caretakers and families and providers have sort of taken this into their own hands and are willing to give it a try, even if it's not specifically FDA approved, just because the potential benefits are great and the potential risks are very small. In our review, the most common side effect was mild sedation that was usually self-limiting, and this occurred in a very small minority of subjects. And when you're in a condition such as a vegetative state, some mild sedation that lasts for 2 or 3 hours is probably a risk that most people are willing to take.
Yeah, that's the least of your worries.
Correct.
Is there sort of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge underground railroad of people's family, like slipping them Zolpidem with sort of a tacit approval of the doctors, even though this isn't technically supposed to be the use case?
Yeah, and I think most neurologic rehabilitation specialists would be familiar with this and would not disapprove if caretakers wanted to at least try using it.
And a prescribing doctor has a decent amount of latitude to make these sort of off-label recommendations in cases like this, right? Even when there's not a big body of study.
Yeah, there's countless medications that are used for off-label purposes. It's ethically condoned if there is a genuine belief that there could be potential benefit to the patient and that the risks are small.
Yeah.
And this is true for scores of different medications that we use routinely in medicine. The cases where people get a little bit more concerned about side effects like sedation were in the more higher functional disorders that we saw, like Parkinson's disease, certain types of post-stroke syndromes, where the patients are fairly alert and are ambulating and doing their daily activities. And that's where you would want to take it into stronger consideration. Well, is this going to cause things like falls or accidents while driving? And generally, again, which was actually quite surprising to me, sedation was a very uncommon side effect and often self-limiting. And this is in patients who are taking the medication 3 or 4 times a day and getting great improvements in their neurologic symptoms and not experiencing any significant sedation. So it was encouraging in that respect, and hopefully encouraging to providers who may have been reluctant to prescribe this medication.
Would you foresee there being any real change to the status quo here? Or is this interesting but kind of going to be hamstrung by the fact that there is a workaround for off-label prescriptions, and the patient populations that might be helped are probably small enough where there's not a huge profit motive for pharmaceutical companies to jump in and initiate new research?
Well, my hope in doing the systematic review was to increase awareness. And just by the amount of positive feedback I've been receiving from the study, I really do think that it's opened a lot of people's eyes to these potential benefits and hopefully sparked their curiosity and maybe encouraging them to pursue their own trials or their own small studies, so that as a community of providers, we can sort of come to a consensus on whether or not we should be using this medication.
Do you feel like you know how that study should be designed as far as dosages throughout the day? And if you were to draw up sort of the study plan, do you have in mind what you would like to see done?
I think initially sort of doing in-clinic trials where a patient could be monitored for, let's say, 3 or 4 hours and sort of seeing what the effects are over the time span of one dosage to first establish what those effects are. And after that, sort of moving into a more community-based approach for using the medication. So is it better to take it 3 times a day or 4 times a day? Is it better to take 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams? Sort of sussing out those effects and closely monitoring for things like adverse effects, sedation, incoordination, altered mental status, things like that. So there's any number of potential studies that could be designed based on the literature that I found in my review. We talked a lot about the effects on people with disorders of consciousness, the vegetative state, for example. But I really want to emphasize that the effects we saw for other neurologic disorders, especially movement disorders, which include things like dystonias and Parkinson's disease, those effects were even more dramatic than what we saw in the disorders of consciousness population. For instance, I mentioned that in the disordered consciousness population, we saw around a 5% response rate. But for instance, for Parkinson's disease, the effect can be up to 60% with significant improvement. For dystonia, it can be up in the above 40%. So these are huge effects. And the patients that receive these medications had often failed all the other first and second and third line medication options that are currently available. Then when they finally received Zolpidem, had remarkable improvement in their symptoms. So I understand that the disorders of consciousness is probably the most peculiar of all the effects we saw, but I don't want that to distract too much from all the other benefits we saw. We found reports for Zolpidem treating over 20 different distinct neurologic disorders, and I think when you consider that, there's a much larger patient population that could potentially be benefiting from this intervention.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Nick Bomalaski for that conversation. There's a famous quote by Isaac Asimov who says that the most exciting phrase to hear in science is not eureka, but instead, that's funny. And this seems like a microcosm of one of those moments where Dr. Bomalaski noticed this strange confluence of oddball Ambien results and decided to do something about it. But it'll be interesting to see what happens next. Hopefully this will get some interest, spur some more research. But keeping things on a tangentially related to sleep theme, let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So maybe sometime you've been sound asleep in bed, but all of a sudden you've heard the unwelcome blare of your alarm clock. You can't tune it out. It bothers you. You're not asleep anymore. You don't want to be awake, but you've got three choices. You can get up, you can hit the snooze button, you can stay in bed and be miserable as the alarm blares, but the one thing you can't do is just ignore it and go back to sleep. The fact that we don't have that option D available to us is apparently because we have something called dorsal raphe nucleus neurons, also known as DRNDA neurons. This is a particular area of the brain that, based on these studies in mice at least, seems to be sort of the on-off override switch for wakefulness. If something is really important and it's something you need to be awake for or stay awake for, it is these DRNDA neurons that crack the cognitive whip. As you know, there are certain things that are important enough to wake up for or to stay awake for. In the neurological trade, these are known as salient stimuli. You could imagine a fire alarm going off when you're asleep, or a bump downstairs that maybe that's a burglar. Or maybe you're awake, you're at a party, it's getting late, your circadian rhythms are saying it's time to go home, call it a night, and suddenly a sexy someone walks into the room and you think, you know what, maybe I can stay at this party a little longer. All of those would count as salient stimuli, but the researchers at Caltech were wondering how these sorts of stimuli actually exert the force on the brain that we know that they do. Researcher Viviana Gradinaru says, to answer this question, we decided to examine an understudied group of dopamine neurons called the dorsal raphe nucleus neurons. People who have damage in this part of the brain have been shown to experience excessive daytime sleepiness, but there wasn't a good understanding of the exact role of these neurons in the sleep-wake cycle and whether they react to internal or external stimuli to influence arousal. The researchers started with a group of mice, keeping a careful eye on their DRNDA neurons, and then exposing those mice to various salient stimuli, everything from unpleasant sensations like shocks and buzzers to good things like the arrival of food or potential mating partners, and they found that the DRNDA neurons became highly active during these events. The researchers speculated that these neurons are like a flare beacon saying, hey, there's something exciting going on here, get aroused. Ryan Cho, who is a graduate student and the first author on the paper, says, we measured the activity of the DRNDA neurons throughout the sleep-wake cycle, and we found that these neurons are least active when the animal is sleeping, and then become more active as the animal starts to wake up. They then employed that favorite research tool called optogenetics, where they bred custom-made mice whose DRNDA cells could be stimulated by light. Then they would do things like stimulate the DRNDA cells when the mouse was in a deep sleep, and just like an alarm bell had gone off, the mouse woke right up. And the exact opposite was true when the DRNDA cells were chemically silenced. This made the mice much more likely to fall asleep, even when there was something important going on, like the odor from a predator or a potential mating partner. If the animal wasn't sleepy, it wouldn't necessarily fall asleep. It wasn't like a knockout switch. But what these neurons seem to do is signal, yes, there is an important need to be awake right now. And if they're not active, then the mouse kind of defaults to whatever its circadian rhythms say. Last but not least, they actually did try the alarm clock test. They chemically silenced the DRNDA cells, and then while the mice were asleep, they played a loud alarm noise, which more often than not, the mice could sleep right through. Says Gradinaru, these experiments showed us that DRNDA cells are necessary for full wakefulness in the face of important stimuli in mice. DRNDA neurons are found analogously in humans, and while they haven't been studied in depth, their degeneration has been correlated with excessive daytime sleepiness in patients with neurodegenerative disorders. Further work is necessary to establish causation in humans and to test the potential of the DRNDA as a therapeutic target for insomnia or oversleeping. There could also be therapeutic potential for the sleep disturbances that accompany other psychiatric disorders such as depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that was it for episode number 205. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you're curious about anything that we talked about here, you can find the links up at smartdrugsmarts.com/205. And if you missed last week's episode, we had a Halloween episode dealing with something called infrasound. If you made it through Halloween without quite enough chills and you didn't catch that episode yet, you might want to go back and check that one out. As for next week, I'm not exactly sure what we've got in store for you. I owe you guys an ayahuasca episode. I was thinking it was going to be this week, but the edit on that's taken a bit longer than we expected. But then we've also got a lot of other episode train cars lined up to go, so it's anyone's ball game at the moment. But I will see you back here next Friday. Same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.